Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Fernandez. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to give it 1 extra minute for those who are just coming onto the line now. So just wait for a minute and we'll get started. Thank you. Let's get started. So welcome, everyone. If you haven't joined, just before we get started, some housekeeping items. This session will be recorded. Both the presentation itself and the recording will be available to you afterwards. If you have any questions, please go to the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel, add those questions, and we'll make sure to address them within the session or a few minutes after we are done presenting. We will make sure. If we don't have enough time, we will send you an email with an answer to your question. So we do appreciate any question that comes our way. Apart from that, I think we're good to get started. Just want to do one quick audio check. John, can you hear me? Actually, I think I got an audio check via Teams. Okay.
Yep, perfect. You're good. Sorry.
Thank you, John. Awesome. Let's get started. So the title of today's webinar is the Disaster Recovery as a Service Cookbook, Recipes for Hybrid Cloud Success. For today's speakers, my name is Andy Fernandez. I'm Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Zerto, an HPE company. And I'm joined by Chris Rogers, who's a technology evangelist here at Zerto as well. Chris has a lot of experience within the service provider side of the business, and we're excited to have him join. A quick look at the agenda. We're going to talk about, the whole premise of why we're discussing disaster recovery as a service, why it's so important to plan this correctly in order to succeed in a hybrid cloud world is because so many organizations are seeing the value of moving towards a DRaaS model. So what we're going to talk about today is first, what are the challenges that every single organization that has an IT department is trying to solve? How are they trying to solve it? Differentiating between the use of backup as a service and then disaster recovery as a service. Talk about the actual challenges that every organization has when it comes to disaster recovery. And then take a look at the thought process, the cost benefit model of, is this something that you're able to do yourself? Or as a consumer, are you better off using the DRaaS model? After that, Chris is going to go over how the Zerto platform is enabling organizations to be able to fulfill their needs, whether it's on premises, whether it's through disaster recovery as a service, and what are the unique differentiators that Zerto has that allows you to succeed within a DRaaS model. After that, we'll go through questions and make sure that we address everything. So let's get started. One of the things that I want to talk about first really is the problem statement, right? What are the challenges that organizations are facing every day? And none of these challenges are new to any of us. We've understood for the last couple of years, we've seen hyper growth in data. Not only hyper growth in the data that we're producing, consuming, but also having to manage and store, but also where this data is located. The rise of work from home, the rise of IoT solutions, and even additional cloud native workloads that are putting data in completely different places presents a lot of challenges. They present infrastructure challenges on how do I store and maintain them, but also management challenges. How do I protect this data? How do I make sure it's available and that my organization is resilient? And then you have cloud. We know we've been talking about cloud for seems like almost a decade. And in the past, everyone was talking about it, but not that many organizations actually had a cloud plan. Now, in today's modern time, everyone has a plan to move towards the cloud. There are different variations of it. Some are looking to finally take some baby steps and move DR and backup to the cloud. Some are running production in the cloud. But every organization has some sort of plans, some sort of digital transformation initiative that requires a move to the cloud. Now, there's a reason for that. The cloud brings a lot of benefits, both financial and technological, but it is a new experience. It is new behavior, and that comes with a lot of challenges as well. How do I know when or how to move this data? What are my responsibilities once this data is in the cloud? That brings a lot of questions that need to be addressed. And ultimately, while you're having to manage all this data, while you're having to evaluate moving to the cloud, you are facing threats, an entire threat landscape. Dozens and dozens of ransomware attacks that every organization is targeted. And it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when you get attacked. So with all these challenges in mind, we still realize that organizations are being pushed to improve their availability, to reduce downtime, to reduce data loss. There is a need for a continuous experience here for organizations within any industry, within financial services, healthcare, manufacturing. These are constant needs. And so it seems tricky because it's not just about how do I keep the lights on, but how do I improve our availability and how do I address these infrastructure challenges that we have as well. And what that actually translates to, what do those responsibilities translate to for most organizations? Well, we like to divide it into two areas, unplanned and planned. There's the unplanned data loss, unplanned downtime that you see, and that is where your DR, your disaster recovery, your backup solutions come in place. As an organization, you are aware that there might be natural disasters, there might be power outages, infrastructure failures, and ransomware that are constant threats to your business. These are threats that come out of nowhere, that introduce unplanned downtime and can be very, very damaging to the business at scale. Then you also have your backup requirements. You know that as long as there are people in an organization, there are going to be mistakes. There's going to be your user errors. There's going to be deletions. There's going to be file corruptions. And we consider ransomware kind of in the middle of disaster recovery and backup, depending on its scale and depending on its severity. But very much so, DR and backup go hand in hand in the sense that you have to address things that you know will happen, you just don't know when. But then on the other hand, there's things that you know, these are fixed issues. You know that you have to retain data for a long period of time if you have some type of regulatory compliance mandate. You have to make sure that you're able not only to store this data, but that you can recover it if needed, specifically from a legal requirement perspective. And then speaking to the cloud challenges that we were talking before, you also might have to be dealing with data center consolidations, whether it's mergers, acquisitions, maybe infrastructure modernization. You have to be able to move data. You have to be able to move it to new infrastructure or even migrate to the cloud. That's what brings planned downtime. Now, although it's planned, it's still downtime, and downtime is very expensive. So as an organization, you're facing all of these activities that you usually have so many tools that you have to address. And that brings a lot of challenges. And with all this in mind, SLAs are still extremely important, and they're getting much more strong. And why is that? Well, think about the cost of downtime, the cost of disruptions to the business. Earlier this year, we sponsored a survey with IDC. It's called the State of Disaster Recovery and Data Protection Readiness Report for 2021. And in this, IDC surveyed over 500 IT pros, mostly mid-sized to enterprise companies. And what they found was interesting. As a collective, the average cost of downtime per hour across all industries and organizational sizes was $250,000 an hour. Now, if you're a smaller company, an SMB attending this webinar today, that number is going to be a little smaller. If you are a Fortune 100 company, that number is a lot higher. And on average, most of these companies saw 8 hours of downtime per year. And that's how much it would cost them, which would be around $2 million. So when you think about this, as organizations become even more dependent on their enterprise applications, on digital services, and on lines of revenue that are digital businesses, the cost of downtime is going to increase. So regardless of all the additional challenges that organizations are facing, you're expected to improve on your recovery time objectives and your recovery point objectives as well. How can I minimize data loss, and how can I get operational and back up and running as quickly as possible? So all these, as I mentioned before in the planned versus unplanned slide, organizations are aware of this and they have multiple tools to do so. But sometimes we don't pick the right tools for the right functionality. And so today's conversation is focused on disaster recovery as a service. But one of the fallacies that we see is that people assume that they're able to use their backup solution for DR. But as we talked about, backup is to be able to store data somewhere, both locally and in the long term, and be able to recover files, folders, and VMs. But that's not what allows you to get your entire business back up and running after a disaster, after a ransomware attack. And that's where there's key differences to understand between backup as a service and disaster recovery as a service. You need both, but to get your business back up and running, you need disaster recovery as a service. And why is that? Well, think about the nature of backup. It's based on VM snapshots, right? You are taking a daily backup job of your environment, and you are taking snapshots. You are using this to be able to store this data in the long term. You can recover this, but it's usually not a recovery that can be done instantly, especially with seconds of data loss. This fulfills your offsite capability when we're talking 3-2-1 rule, and it's usually around file folder recoveries and restores. And the SLA is not as important because maybe you get a legal requirement that you have to send something out in a couple of days. Let's just recover this from our cold storage, send it out. That's not the same criticality as there is a hurricane coming and we need to fail over all of this data to a secondary site. So those are the key differences why with disaster recovery as a service, you can't rely on VM snapshots. You need replication technology. You need the ability to perform an entire failover. I need to move my entire data center, all the data there, from one site to another, whether it's a site or an application. This needs to be at a secondary location, whether that is a secondary location that I own, a public cloud, or service provider. And as I mentioned, this is for large scale recovery. And it will be required to run production systems from, right? This is something that your most critical applications depend on. And to furthermore this DR versus backup discussion, I want to make sure that I address the fact that backup is extremely important for organizations. But you can't use backup as your primary tool to recover your business from a disaster. Why is that? Well, the same study that we had when I talked about the cost of downtime added a lot more questions focused on ransomware. And here's what we saw. We saw that 95.1% of organizations have suffered a ransomware or malware attack in the past 12 months. 80% of them indicated at least one attack resulting in data corruption. 43% experienced unrecoverable data within the past 12 months. And 36% have suffered more than 25 attacks during that time. As I mentioned before, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And when that happens, backup has proven not to be the most reliable source when it comes to getting your business back up and running and getting your data back. And why is that? Well, think about the reasons for unrecoverable data. Why is backup not the most effective tool? This is also from that same survey. And we saw that the primary reasons are, well, there's a large amount of data loss that occurs in the backup gap. The backups are corrupted. There's system failures on the backup side. There's always human error, and tape is not always your most reliable strategy. So when we talk about using disaster recovery solution, and when we talk about trying to use backup, these are the 4 key reasons. 1, you need to recover your applications consistently. Backups do this on a per VM basis, not on a per application basis, and we will touch on that in a few minutes. There is no built-in orchestration or automation. The workflows that allow you to easily fail over data to a secondary site do not exist in backup technologies. Also, remember, as I mentioned, these are VM snapshots that you're using backup for. VM snapshots bring disruptions to your production systems. Replication doesn't do that. You need to be able to minimize disruptions. Backup is not the way to do that. And you also need to make sure that you can perform large-scale testing of these failover solutions. So if you can't prove that you can fail over, you have to assume that you cannot fail over. So these are kind of some of the core principles as to why backup for DR is not a good idea. And to give you a little bit more insight, when we talk about the recovery point objectives, when you're using snapshot-based disaster recovery or backup, you are taking a snapshot, a daily or nightly backup job. If something happens at 5 p.m. and you have to recover from the last night's job, that is already data loss that you've experienced. With Zerto, with replication solutions, this is near synchronous replication. So you have block level replication that's happening every 5 seconds. So you're comparing the ability to have a 5-second recovery point objective versus a 12-hour recovery objective. So these are in summary why backup is not a good idea for DR. And that's why we've talked about the lengthy protection gaps, where if I have a nightly backup, I cannot depend on that in order to successfully recover the day's data. So now that we kind of covered the DRaaS versus DRaaS, we need to talk about disaster recovery solutions, because they're not all the same. And it's very important that if we're looking for a disaster recovery as a service model that works for us, it will only work very well and achieve those financial and tech goals that you have of using the cloud if you have the right disaster recovery solution. So when you think about the solution selection criteria, what I call it, right? It's a kind of a long name, but when you look for a DR solution, what should you be looking for? The most important thing, you need flexibility. You cannot be tied to specific storage. You cannot be tied to an appliance. This is not array-based replication where you need homogeneous storage from one site to another. You should be able to replicate your data to any infrastructure that you want, and you can move that data whenever you want. It's all about freedom of choice. That's what disaster recovery as a service is. I want to use what's best for me, both financially and technologically, and not be tied into something for 5 years waiting for the next hardware refresh. So flexibility is key. And with flexibility comes the ability to have this in software only. You should not have to use an appliance. You should not have to depend on your storage infrastructure to do so. You just need something that you can quickly install, use, and start replicating. Part of why disaster recovery solutions are so important is because they should be designed to be simple to use. Our recovery time objectives are very important. How quickly can I get my data back up and running? How quickly can I get these applications up and running? You need ability to have simple workflows to do so. It cannot be difficult to perform this because then you're introducing more error. Scale is extremely important, especially in DRaaS. Whether you are looking to protect 10 VMs or you are looking to protect 10,000 VMs, your solutions will be able to scale with you. So you need to look for scale out architecture. And at the core of this is availability. You want to make sure that you're minimizing data loss, right? That you're improving those recovery point objectives from days and hours to minutes and seconds, and the recovery times themselves, which are equally as important, to minutes. And that is only being able to do if you're using a replication solution, but if you also have the orchestration and an automation that allows you to perform this in a couple of clicks. So when we think of, I have to select a disaster recovery tool, what should I use? Think, I need something that's flexible. I need something that's software only, that's simple, that's scalable, that improves my SLAs, and that has built-in orchestration. So when we think about the challenges that we see right now, because the challenges don't stop at backup, right? We have DR challenges as well that we see. And this is all part of that same study that I've mentioned. The biggest DR challenges that we're seeing is organizations might not have the skill set to be able to execute on this. A lot of that comes from having to use solutions that are very difficult to both install, deploy, configure, and manage. But it is a challenge. There's also resource, time, labor. We might not have enough people to maintain a secondary site. We might not have enough people who are aware enough to do this. Recovery times are a very important one as well. And then we have challenges with transferring migration. So there's a couple of challenges there, right, that are applicable to disaster recovery as a service, like your cost. I want to be able to move this to the cloud, but I find it difficult. I'm not able to test this solution. We don't have orchestration. These are all very important challenges. So when you are looking at your next disaster recovery solution, when you're looking at DRaaS, make sure to keep these challenges in mind. How does this new solution solve this for me? And that's where disaster recovery as a service comes in. This Gartner report does provide really interesting insights as to why people are actually using disaster recovery as a service. And Chris and I are going to show you a couple of ways on how people can actually use DRaaS, but ultimately there's going to be two ways. There's going to be the way of someone else is hosting the site, but I am performing the operations, or I'm getting a fully managed experience where they're doing everything for me. And the reason people choose that is, well, maybe they don't have the skill set to be able to have a mature BCDR organization. Maybe they want to improve their SLAs. Maybe their DR that they thought that was DR was just backup or tape and disk. Maybe they're facing a hardware refresh and they don't want to have to face this and they'd rather just use somebody else's site. Or they're seeing increased disasters and they want to be able to do so. One of the things that we're seeing as a primary driver to disaster recovery as a service is ransomware. Organizations are not feeling confident about their ability to restore and recover post-attack, so they're wanting to use not only other infrastructure, but other people's expertise as well. And there's so many other reasons why, but at the end of the day, it's about time, resource, skill, SLA, and those are what the critical motivators for why organizations are using disaster recovery as a service. So with that, there's so many ways to do this. But when I mention all of the value of disaster recovery as a service, it's still important to know that for some organizations, they're still better off doing their own thing. Think of it, we're going to use the analogy here of a kitchen, right? When you're building your own data center, when you're managing your own environment, think of this as you're cooking from home. You are having to buy and source all of the ingredients. You own the pans, you own the oven, you own everything. And you are responsible for making this meal. And for some organizations, that works really well. Some organizations, whether it's because of government regulation, are CapEx heavy, and they need to rely, because of budget cycles, on capital expenditures. Maybe they already have the dedicated headcount, and it is a requirement within their industry. So when you want to be responsible for absolutely everything, you have this skill set to do so, it does make sense to build your own data center, right? So when we say when to build your own or when to keep that is you prefer CapEx investments. You already have a geo-dispersed data center and you're willing to refresh that hardware. You prefer to have that responsibility on your own, and you also have a large IT organization skill already, and you require in-house skills. That's really important. But now, if that's not the customer profile that you have, not the consumer profile that you have, then it makes sense to use disaster recovery as a service. And why is that, right? I've already made the analogy of, if you are cooking from home and you have your own kitchen, you are responsible for everything. So when it comes to disaster recovery and you're building it all out on your own, think of that from a total cost of ownership. For example, you have to provide the upfront capacity for compute. You are responsible for the purchase and management of the storage. You're responsible for the maintenance contracts on the hardware that you own. You're responsible for the networking and firewall infrastructure. You also need to go out and purchase the solutions for disaster recovery. You need that replication. You need also to maintain a hypervisor and the management tool licenses. You need monitoring. You need support. Sometimes you need professional services. You have to dedicate time and resources to patching and maintenance. You need to pay for power in the DR. You need to pay for cooling on the DR. So when you look at all that, that works for some organizations. But when your organization is about how do we reduce costs, how do we move towards a consumption model and pay for what we need versus having to pay everything up front, it makes sense to go with disaster recovery as a service, where you have the right sizing, you use tiered storage that works for you, you purchase your disaster recovery as a service license, you use the on-demand compute instead of upfront. And there's additional benefits that come with DRaaS, which is it's a lot simpler. You are using a consumption model that's elastic. You pay for what you use, not what you think you need. You will see RPO and RTO improvements, and you're also able to improve your testing. So these are interesting models to look at, interesting cost benefit analysis to have, but it's really important that if you're making this decision, that you build a model to understand all of your cost centers and what makes more sense for your organization. And it's critical to spend some time doing that. But with that, now that I've talked a little bit around the upfront decisions you have to make around doing it yourself, building your own on-premises site, or using disaster recovery as a service, I'm going to bring Chris Rogers in, who's a technology evangelist, to talk a little bit about that. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Really excited to be talking today. This is one of the topics that's kind of close to my heart. So I suppose a bit about me. I actually spent a lot of my time in the IT industry in service providers, and that's actually where I kind of learned Zerto and first heard about Zerto. We had a disaster recovery as a service platform that we built and maintained, and then I actually moved over into Zerto and supported our service provider community from a technical standpoint. And then recently I've moved into the technology evangelist role, working alongside Andy and the technical marketing team. So I like to think I'm kind of pretty well placed to kind of give you some lowdown on disaster recovery as a service, and the kind of two different flavors. And there is a spectrum to disaster recovery as a service. It's not just the two things I'm going to describe today. There's all places in between the two places I'm going to kind of tell you about today. So it's not kind of binary, but I'm going to kind of go with the two most popular that we see in the marketplace. So the first one being self-service strats. So this is normally kind of like pre-packaged offerings. So usually it's software only, and the software is chosen for you, right? You pick a place you want to go to, and then whatever they've already chosen for you is what you use to replicate and what you use for orchestration and automation. But the setup and maintenance is still required by the organization themselves, right? So all they do is give you the platform and the tooling, but then you're required to kind of put it all together and do it all yourself. So that responsibility then still lies with the organization. The service provider or the public cloud or wherever it may be who's providing that self-service offering will be responsible for like the platform and the uptime of that, but not necessarily making sure that it's set up correctly, making sure replication's happening properly, making sure that your runbooks are set up properly. And then normally it's going to be a third-party site, so maybe a public cloud or a service provider site as well. And if we kind of go back to the analogy that Andy was saying earlier, which is the kitchen, this is kind of more about the kind of like the meal kits we get, so the Gustos or the HelloFresh, whatever it might be. So someone's packaging a load of stuff up for you, and they're giving you maybe like a recipe card or an instruction guide on how to do it. But it gets delivered to your front door, and after that, the responsibility is purely on you. You still got to use your kitchen to cook it, and you've got to use your skill set to cook it as well. And if you're anything like me, I'm a terrible cook. So even though someone can put everything in a box, tell me exactly what I'm going to do, it's not going to taste as good as if someone else cooked it for me. So just understanding that is a model that exists, and that might be kind of a halfway house between the fully unmanaged and the fully managed that people like to go to. So when would you use this service? So if you haven't got a secondary site, or your sites aren't geodispersed enough, as we've seen, organizations, they've kind of maybe got a merger and acquisition, but they're maybe only 50 kilometers apart, where natural disasters can still span that. So maybe they want to use a secondary or a tertiary site, for instance, to kind of have that big geodispersed, and maybe even like separate continent, for instance, or the other side of a country. You want to reduce your data center footprint, but kind of still maintain overall control. So you don't want to hand over the keys to someone else and say, run that for me. Maybe you've got already staff that can monitor and maintain it, but you want someone else's site to help you kind of run the secondary site for you. And maybe your organization is shifting from CapEx into OpEx. This is a nice way to start moving some of that cost spend from a CapEx expenditure into OpEx. So moving disaster recovery into as a service model is a kind of a nice starting point. The same with kind of cloud adoption. It's a really nice ramp up to starting your cloud journey, is moving that disaster recovery to the cloud and getting everyone used to what the cloud is, how it works, how it's priced, how it's utilized, those types of things. Thanks, Andy. So the next one is fully managed DRaaS. So it's pretty self-explanatory. It's fully managed by usually a service provider or system integrator. This can be on public or private clouds, right? Or it can be service provider clouds or somewhere in between. Even a hybrid cloud environment can work for these fully managed operations as well. So just because it's a managed DRaaS solution, it doesn't have to be just a service provider site or your own site that they manage for you, or their own data centers, their colo. They can even do that in the public cloud for you as well. So you kind of got a spectrum of where you'd like to deploy, and finding the right partner for you is going to be crucial in being successful with DRaaS. The key difference here, that you're usually going to be backed by strict SLAs, and that's what a lot of people are looking for when they're looking at managed disaster recovery as a service. Is, okay, I don't really mind what you do with my stuff because you're running it, you're maintaining it, you're making sure everything works for me, but I need to have these goals met. And the organization may say, I need my recovery time objective to be 1 hour and my recovery point objective to be 15 minutes. And the service provider will make sure they have the staff and the expertise and the technology behind it to meet those organizational objectives. So it's really, really down to the service provider. That's where that responsibility lies, to make sure that you've got a replication service and a DRaaS service that's up and running, it's working properly, it's optimized, and your run books are all working properly. So when you do need to fail over, it's going to be working, and they're going to help you as well. And I think Andy touched on this earlier as well, but I think one of the key points is actually accessing that experience and that knowledge, and you can kind of mature your DR strategy overnight really, really quickly and kind of to a very, very high standard. It's kind of like, if it's the first time you're doing something, everyone's a bit nervous about doing anything for the first time. Whereas, these service providers or these system integrators, they see ransomware all the time. They've got loads of customers who are recovering from them on a daily basis. So it's kind of just, part of the business as usual daily routine for them. They know how to do it, they know how to deal with it, and they know what the steps are. Likelihood for most organizations that they get hit with ransomware for the first time, they don't really know what to do. They don't know what the steps they need to do to actually to recover, or what they need to do for quarantining and all those types of things. So it's really, really nice to have that kind of person to phone up and say, look, we're in a bit of a problem here. We need some help, and that's fine. And then a design, installation, ongoing maintenance, they're all going to be provided by the provider as well. So that kind of making sure everything's working okay, but actually making sure it's set up right in the first place, because we can have the best tool in the world. If you give me a Formula One car, I'm not going to be able to drive it. I don't have a clue how to do it. So even though it's the fastest car on the planet, you give it to someone who doesn't know what they're doing, it's probably not going to work that well. And that goes for the same for any software or any technology, making sure you put it in the right people's hands. And these guys have that expertise as well. So when would a company choose fully managed DRaaS? So if they've got maybe limited technical personnel, or they're actually just trying to free up some of their IT resources to look to future projects like containerization or reimagining or re-architecting applications they're currently using. So maybe taking some time away from kind of keeping the lights on and doing disaster recovery testing and that type of thing, moving that resource away into something more profitable for the company. If they're looking to build a mature DR operation overnight, that's something that can't come just overnight by hiring the right staff. If you hire a service provider or get a service provider system integrator involved, that's going to mature that offering overnight because it's going to be a very, very simple solution. They know what they're doing and they can help you design, implement, and maintain that solution as well. High security requirements, making sure that everything's dialed in, making sure that you've got the right security requirements for your offering, and talking to your service provider or your system integrator about what your requirements are. They're going to be able to then recommend, how long do we keep things for? Where do we store things for segregation? Dedicated resources. So if you don't have dedicated resources but want to use the service provider's resources, and now I'm talking about time of staff, but also data center resources as well. So if you don't have a secondary site or you don't want to invest in a secondary infrastructure, this is great. And then if you want an easy onboarding, right, we just want to click and go. This is great for fully managed DRaaS, and some people will have a hybrid of that, so someone will fully manage it for them, but you can still have visibility to make sure everything's working properly, but everything was done by them. So that's kind of when you would choose a fully managed DRaaS. So now I'm going to go into why Zerto for DRaaS. So at Zerto, we have over 350 service providers that offer disaster recovery as a service out to their customer base. And kind of based on some of these key differentiators is why we feel like we've got the best solution to power that engine or that DRaaS under the hood. So the first one is near synchronous replication. Andy, can you move the slide on for me? Perfect, thank you. So software only and simple deployment, as Andy mentioned earlier. So we are software only, so we don't have to worry about shipping hardware to customer sites to get them on board or anything like that. It's all software, so it's very easy to deploy and very easy to use. And the near synchronous replication means we can achieve recovery point objectives of seconds and recovery time objectives of only minutes as well. So we can really dial in and make sure you're hitting those RPOs and RTOs that your organization needs. We don't have any impact on production workloads, and that's during protection and also during disaster recovery testing as well. So we've got organizations who have gone from never passing a disaster recovery test or only doing them once or 2 years to testing kind of every week or every month, because there is zero impact to doing disaster recovery testing. So they can spin it up exactly when they want and spin it back down again when they want as well. So they can really make sure that their DR is healthy and they know what they're actually doing. I'm sure most of you on the call have, change approval boards, and when those changes go through, they'll get scrutinized. But I doubt any of you run disaster recovery tests immediately after a change approval board or a change has gone through, because no one really thinks about doing that. But as we're making all those changes to our production environment, we need to be thinking about disaster recovery as well. So if those changes have impacted it, wouldn't it be great if we could just test immediately after a change with 3 clicks? And we can go, oh, that change didn't have an impact, or actually even better, that change did have an impact, and we need to make sure we change our disaster recovery plan accordingly, and we've caught that on a test rather than catching it in a live event. And as Andy mentioned earlier, no scheduling, no snapshots, and no agents. So it doesn't matter where you're deploying to, we're not taking snapshots of your virtual machines, hence why we can have those RPOs of seconds, and we're not having any impact on production virtual machines as well. And we're hardware and storage agnostic. So it doesn't matter where you're replicating to. So from here, we've got vCenter or SCVMA on premises, and then we're going to maybe vCenter on the other side, or in this instance, AWS or Azure for hyperscale. It doesn't matter for us. We're agnostic between those platforms, and we can do DR to those platforms and then move you back out again when you need to fail back as well. And we can also go to service provider sites as well. And then we have our unique journal. So the journal is one of my favorite parts of Zerto, actually. I think it's kind of overlooked a little bit, but so having the journal is like a diary or a log, or a journal, if you will. It has all the recovery points in, and they're only going to be seconds apart, and that can be anywhere from 1 hour all the way up to 30 days. So that really gives you flexibility on what you want to recover and when you want to recover them to. So I'd always argue to people, get the longest journal you possibly can, because that's going to give you the most amount of restore points to restore to. Being only 5 or 10 seconds apart, we're going to have thousands upon thousands of restore points, which is going to minimize the amount of data loss you're going to have in an environment. And then when it comes to the granularity as well, we can recover individual applications, whole sites, individual files from virtual machines, or individual applications as well. So we have all that range of the granularity in the objects we can restore. So it's not just about restoring every single virtual machine. Sometimes it might be restoring a group of applications to another site, or it might just be failing those over to test that because that happened to be changed last week. So we can kind of do that granular testing and granular restores as well. So if we looked at traditional protection, we'd be a per VM granularity. So we take the enterprise application, so it's made up of multiple virtual machines. So an app server, a web server, a DB server, and a file server. And then we back those up overnight. So anywhere between 11 o'clock and 5 a.m. is fine to be backed up because that's our backup window. But then when we come to recover those from backup as a service or just normal backup, or even just from normal replication, we have to recover those individual entities as individual entities. So there's no cohesion between what they actually do or their relationship between each other, which leads to an inconsistent recovery. It leads to more manual effort when we're going for recovery, and potentially leads to more errors as well. But with Zerto, the way that we do things is we group all those VMs together in an application consistency group. So we call them virtual protection groups, or VPG for short. So every 5 seconds or so, when we're taking those checkpoints and adding those to the journal, like we explained a moment ago, we're grouping all those virtual machines together and taking a checkpoint at exactly the same point in time. So when we come to recovery, we're recovering a whole application as its entire entity rather than its component parts. And the moment it's moved across to the other site and brought back up again, it's all from a consistent point in time. So if it was working when it was taking the checkpoint from, everything's going to be in sync. So the file server and the DB server in sync, the app, the web server in sync. So everything's talking at exactly the same point in time. So nice and consistent recovery. So what I like to think of it's a little bit like a jigsaw mat. If people have done jigsaws before. So enterprise applications are made up of multiple parts, a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. And we put them all together. We spend ages putting it together. And once we've done it, we leave it and we look at it and we let it run. If I wanted to move that jigsaw to somewhere else, likely is I'm going to have to break some of it up, put it back in the box, and then take it somewhere else and then put it back together again. But I can put it back together in maybe bigger chunks. I know roughly how it goes together, so it's probably not going to take me as long, but it's still going to take some manual effort. I like to think of what we do at Zerto as a little bit like one of those jigsaw mats. So you put your jigsaw out, you just roll it up at that point in time, you take it across to wherever you're going to, public cloud, hybrid cloud, service provider, wherever it may be, and then you unroll it again. And it's exactly as it was at the point in time we had it beforehand. So that's kind of like my little favorite analogy that I use, just to kind of visualize how it works. Next slide, please, Andy. Perfect. And then unlocking cloud. I know we've spoken a lot about cloud and disaster recovery as a service and backup as a service, kind of echoes that cloud journey people are going. But being able to unlock that in multiple cloud environments as well. So not just service providers, but having it in the hyperscales as well, and even the VMware on public cloud environments as well. So really giving you the choice of flexibility, not only just being able to get you into those clouds, but also being able to get you back out again. I think that's one of the key important pieces, is having that fail back plan as well, understanding what it would look like, because we all know that public clouds can be expensive to run in. They're great and they're elastic resources, and they're great for storing data for long periods of time relatively cheaply. But we don't want to be running there for forever, because that might cost us a fortune. We haven't planned that out properly. So we need to make sure we have a quick fail-back plan and something that we know how to get back to quickly to minimize our costings in those clouds as well. And we need to make sure when we're doing public cloud as well, we're not just utilizing what we've done on premises. So Zerto's actually built native services inside of the hyperscale as well. So we use scale set workers, queues, and then object storage as well, to make sure we keep the cost as low as possible as well. So when we're migrating or doing disaster recovery service into these clouds, it doesn't matter which one we're using, we're going to be using the same technology going into those clouds. So the continuous data protection that we mentioned earlier, so in and between those clouds as well. And then the last piece from me before I give it back to Andy is the orchestration, automation, analytics. So we mentioned earlier around how a disaster recovery solution should be simple and easy to use. And that's really what Zerto is. It's got such a simple an initiative user interface. It's very easy to use. Everything's orchestrated and automated under the hood. And by automation, orchestration, I don't mean like having an API that we can script against and you can, your coders out there can go and create some amazing stuff. We do have that available, but actually being able to click one button or 2 or 3 buttons and have a whole site fail over, and making sure those VMs land on the right networks, on the right compute stack, on the right storage, with the right IP addresses, and get booted up in the right order as well. That's what I'm talking about, is making it super simple for disaster recovery to be done and maintained as well. And it's a simple implementation. So no matter whether we're deploying in the cloud, deploying on premises, or deploying to a service provider, it's pretty much the same wherever we go. And it will look the same and feel the same wherever we go. So we don't have any difference. We integrate with your existing tech stack as well. So we don't need to change any hardware. We don't need to change how you're running today. We implement and slide in and slot in to whatever you're doing today. So we're not going to come in and say, just because you want to move disaster recovery to the cloud or disaster recovery to a service provider, you need to change all these things on your existing tech stack. That's not how we want to run. And as Andy mentioned earlier, scale is important because maybe your organization is only 100, 200 VMs today. But what happens in the future? What happens if we get to 500, 600 VMs, right? We need to make sure that we choose a solution that scales up and down with us, making sure that we're not going to be, as we scale up, we lose SLA on that as well, making sure as we go towards the thousands or tens of thousands of VMs that we're still achieving RPOs of seconds and RTOs of minutes on there as well. Perfect, Andy. Next slide, please. And over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate your insight and your expertise. I know you've been working with service providers for so long. I'm absolutely going to steal that jigsaw puzzle analogy, and there's nothing you can do about it, Chris. I'm sorry. So with that, let's talk about how Zerto delivers return on investment, right? When we think about return on investment, that's a high motivation for disaster recovery as a service. Why is that? Well, as we talked about throughout this presentation, I want to save money, but I also want to shift from CapEx to OpEx. I only want to pay for what I need, but I also want to improve the infrastructure that I'm using and improve my availability. Zerto has been doing that for over a decade for organizations. And I have a couple of examples here. For example, HCA Healthcare. We were able to replace multiple point solutions they had from 4 to 1 and save them over $10 million. They realized Zerto gave them the best RPOs, the best RTOs in one single interface. They did not have a need for additional tools, right? So it's both a cost and resource time savings. For example, others like BJ's were looking to eliminate their use of the secondary site. They want to use DRaaS. They want to use a public cloud. They saw over $800,000 in savings in 3 years. And then there's operational efficiency. I want to spend less time on certain of these activities to keep the lights on. And Starbucks saw that with a 16x decrease in time spent on production support processes. United Airlines has an application, their application, I'm sure all of us have used at some point, and the website. And that generates about $1 million an hour. They trust Zerto to protect that. They trust Zerto to be the engine that keeps them running, that keeps that application, these moneymakers, going. And then you have organizations, as we mentioned, that have expectations of planned downtime because they need to merge data centers. Instead of having an increase in downtime because they need to merge data centers, XPO Logistics used Zerto. They were able to merge 21 data centers into 6 in 3 months, in 36 months. So these are critical capabilities that all show the value not only of using DRaaS, but also using Zerto and DRaaS, which is an incredible combination. But we have more examples. One here is Gray County. Gray County was able to use Zerto to go to Microsoft Azure. And this quote by Evan Davis, their infrastructure manager, just shows you everything you need. Government organizations like ours are often stretched thin, and each agency consists of a lot of small businesses, in a sense. Zerto and Azure met all our very demanding requirements. They just work together seamlessly. Zerto is a partner. It is not an impediment. It is actually a catalyst to help you move towards the cloud faster, without disruption, and to improve your DR experience. And that was a public cloud use, but there's also disaster recovery as a service. So you have organizations like Kronos that are able to shift to that full managed model, and they're able to protect thousands of VMs with much better RPOs for their tier 1 applications. And they're also able to onboard and protect new customers quickly and efficiently. So regardless of the flavor, as we've talked about today, of whether you want to go on premises and stay there, or you want to have a self-service or a fully managed disaster recovery as a service model, Zerto is able to get you there. So what I want to do is I want to leave you with some information and some assets. And if you go to the chat on the control panel, you'll see the links that Chris will be posting there. But this is kind of, think of it as a source that you can go to and kind of get an understanding of Zerto's value and the resources that we include. So if you go to this link, you'll see this page that's titled Shift Your Disaster Recovery and Backup to the Cloud. It goes over thought leadership around control. How do I have a cost benefit analysis to do so? What does this mean? What is the technology that is the right choice for me? Are there examples of other organizations that have done the same? But also, who can I partner with? Maybe I know that I need a managed service provider. I need somebody to do everything for me. That fits my needs. Zerto has a network of over 350 managed service providers that you can tap into and find the right one for your needs, which Chris is also putting a link there as well. So I invite you to explore this, take a look, identify really where are you as an organization, where do you want to get to, how can Zerto help you do that? So with that, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into the chat functionality and make sure that we can address all these questions. So Chris, you and I will kind of go through these with the amount of time that we have left. And if we're not able to get to your questions, we will send you an email. We will send you the response and any additional resources that are required. So let's get to the questions.